and welcome back to the TLDR podcast. I'm Jack Kelly and I'm joined by Zac Michaelis.
Hello.
And Rory Taylor.
Hello.
How are you both doing?
Good, yeah.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, very good.
I know you looked at each other to consult as to how you were doing. Welcome back to the TLDR UK podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be running through some new election polling data that breaks down some interesting elements of who's voting for which parties, what trends there are, and specifically we're looking at the difference between older and younger voters in the UK and how that differs from the rest of the world. Before we get into that, before we discuss our underreported stories, and before we get to the World Leader Leaderboard, just one more reminder that our newspaper, Too Long, is available at a reduced price right now. That's the newspaper that we made at the end of last year, reviewing everything that happened in 2023, plus some predictions for 2024. As I told you last week, we intentionally produced a handful too many in order to have some spare copies for returns, for dealing with issues, that kind of thing. Anyway, we have these copies now available for sale because we didn't end up needing them and we don't want a bunch of newspapers to go unsold. So if you'd like a copy at the reduced price of $5.99, that's down from $9.99 originally. Or if you'd like a digital copy, which is only available for the first time now for $3.99, then you want to head over to our store. Both are only available for a limited time, so we won't be mentioning it that many more times, I promise. Let's get into the show properly. And Zac, let's start with your underreported story of the week.
So my underreported story is something we covered over on TLDR UK, and it is the new Northern Ireland sort of deal that's returned to power sharing. Mm-hmm. I think we don't go into the details aren't why I think it's underreported. The details are to do with basically sort of like how the checks on goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland that aren't going on to the Republic of Ireland, how many checks are placed on those sort of goods, if you can call them exports, and if they count as exports because they're going between GB and NI, but whatever. It's about reducing those checks to make the whole Windsor framework more palatable to unionists who have been sort of boycotting government in Northern Ireland, and because of how power sharing works, that means that the Northern Irish Assembly has basically been collapsed for the best part of 18 months, something like that.
I think it's like 2 years now.
2 years now, yeah. And I mean, it's not unusual in Northern Ireland. It's about 40% of the time since 1997, since it was set up, the assembly has been collapsed. But I think it's underreported because we just don't pay enough attention to Northern Ireland. And I think that especially in like British political discourse, we really underestimate like how it sounds melodramatic. I'm not saying it's likely per se, but there's a non-trivial chance of it happening. Let's say in like the next like couple of decades. Of Northern Ireland eventually leaving the UK. I mean, you now have like a nationalist first minister. Is it Michelle O'Neill?
O'Neill, yeah.
From Sinn Féin. And I think in the immediate aftermath of this deal, she said that, I think she said a reunited Ireland is a generation away or something like that. And I mean, the fact that wasn't making headlines in the UK, you know, that basically the idea of part of the UK breaking away, like a fundamental change to the union is quite telling, I think. And we like in the UK, and this is to our detriment, we don't pay enough attention to Northern Ireland. I think it's amazing quite how fragile the union looks, and we often overlook this, especially when you consider that, like, let's just say like 2 decades ago, the idea of any part of the union leaving would have been utterly unthinkable. And now you'd struggle to find someone who doesn't think that that a part of the union leaving is possible. So yeah, I think it's big news, and it probably should have got more attention because of its like constitutional implications for the union.
It'll be huge. The amount of attention that Scottish independence receives as a concept.
Yeah.
Video on it coming out later this week.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Northern Ireland is often overlooked in the same regard.
Yeah, I think so.
Rory, what's your underreported story this week?
So mine is this developing political crisis that's happening in Senegal at the moment. There's big protests there after the president postponed the presidential election that was meant to happen on the 25th of February. He's postponed it kind of indefinitely, hasn't set a new date yet, amid this dispute over like the approval and or the rejection of certain presidential candidates. So for reference, Senegal is usually kind of considered one of West Africa's or even Africa's most stable democracies. It's had peaceful transfers of power, especially when you think of that region. We've had all those recent coups. It's a bit of a an oasis of democracy in the region.
Sure.
But that's really looking like it's being undermined at the moment. So it's the first time a presidential vote has ever been postponed in Senegal's history because it's got a pretty good election history. But anyway, Macky Sall is the name of the president. He's not actually running for re-election. He served 2 terms and drew quite a lot of praise last year when he said he wasn't going to run for a 3rd term and kind of bend the constitution to allow him to. So he got a lot of praise for that. But now he's kind of on the other side of things where, you got international concern and the opposition kind of condemning his postponement of the election. But it's this slightly difficult situation where there definitely was a lot of dodgy stuff going on with the approval and rejection of certain candidates. So there is a world in which this delay enables the election to be freer and fairer, but also the way people have been reacting to it and the way that the government has been reacting to those protests. There's been tear gas fired at protesters, mobile internet's been restricted. I think a TV station was taken off the air. It shows all the signs of a kind of spiraling crisis.
Yeah.
And this is at a time when that region in particular is struggling, kind of democratically speaking. So I think that's definitely quite a big story going on at the moment.
Worth paying attention to. Yeah. Definitely underreported.
No good African news.
No.
Not at the moment, it's quite depressing actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's quite a
sad.
tragic note to end what's normally quite a fun bit of the podcast on.
Bleak.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the latest polling data out of the UK. This is YouGov polling, correct? That has broken down voting intention by a whole load of metrics and has sparked a bunch of conversations on Twitter and elsewhere. But the one I think we want to pull out specifically is around age and the different age groups and how they're voting, which is a topic that we discussed on the TLDR Global channel today, in fact, yesterday when you're watching. The kind of age and gender gap and all these different things that are impacting how people are voting. But in the UK, the age gap is the one that is the most interesting. Yeah. So do you want to break down what the data is telling us?
Yeah, so basically we have this idea that, basically older people more conservative, young people less conservative. And this polling kind of bears that out. But the really interesting thing is that the Conservative Party are only leading in one age group, and that's the 70 plus age group.
Okay.
In every single age group below that, so from 18 to 69, Labour beat the Conservatives, which is, catastrophic for the Conservative Party. So for reference, at the last election, the crossover age where it went from being more Labour to more Tory, that was around 39, 40.
Yeah.
Now it's 69 to 70 years old.
Wow.
So since the last election, it's shot up, a few decades. And even in that 70 plus age group, the Conservatives are only drawing 43% of the vote, which is down from 67% in 2019. So even in that age group, they're kind of collapsing.
Crazy difference.
Yeah. Labour winning 18 to 69-year-olds, and then you've obviously got the other parties, kind of Greens, Lib Dems generally do better with younger people as well. But yeah, it's the Tories that have completely collapsed, even between the kind of 50 to 69-year-olds, which previously have been more conservative.
Yeah.
And I think this just is a testament to the total collapse in Tory polls, really. And it makes their job, or just highlights how difficult their job going into the election is going to be, because they've really just lost that core part of their base. Mostly to Labour, that if you kind of break it down where people are moving to, Labour are the biggest beneficiaries, but also Reform perform best in that 70 plus group. So 17% of 70 plus say they would vote Reform. That's taken a big chunk from the Conservatives as well. People will be used to it by now. This is another Conservatives doing badly in the polling story.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think this is even worse for the Tories than it even looks at face value, because with those 70 plus voters, or just let's just say pensioners who are voting Tory, and more so than they're voting Labour, there's something I think mentioned by Stephen Bush on the FT podcast the other day, is that are those pensioners, are they actual diehard Tory voters, or are they just literally small C Conservatives? They're incumbent voters who just vote for whoever's going to keep them safe. They're voting for the Tories because they've kept their pension triple lock safe, they've kept their social housing safe, or whatever it is. But if Keir Starmer comes in and keeps the triple lock and doesn't do anything significant to the way pensioners are treated, will they just shift over to Keir Starmer? Will they just see him as the safe choice? And if that happens, after whenever the election happens this year, Tories can be in a truly catastrophic place, because once those if those older pensioner voters who aren't necessarily Tories, like through and through Tories, they're just sort of incumbency voters.
Yeah.
If they shift over to Labour, then there's no base left for the Tories. But the other thing I think is really interesting about this polling is that it's in the British discourse, the Tories often speak about like, oh, well, it's young people. Like, we just don't get young people. Young people are left wing, and that's what happens. And they get right wing as they get older. It's like the very Thatcherite meme. But that's just not the experience of. It's not the international experience, and it's definitely the experience in Europe, which is probably, like, I'd say, culturally the closest place to the UK.
Sure.
And in most recent elections, we've seen, across Europe, we've seen a whole load of what are sometimes described as far right or populist right parties springing up and doing surprisingly well. And one of the reasons they're doing so well is that they're actually really quite popular with young people. So Geert Wilders, for example, it's the PVV. Is that it? Yeah. Most popular demographic was 18 to 24-year-olds. I think I'm right in saying that. Someone don't track me, but they're very, very popular with young people, essentially. Le Pen in the election in whatever it was, 2022, did very, very well with millennials. Not so well with Gen Z, but did quite well with millennials. And in Poland, the really quite far right, I think it's fair to say, I don't think that's partisan, Confederation Party, they perform best with basically young men. And you see this trend basically going across all of Europe, is that actually these populist, like right-wing parties do perform quite well with younger people. And the idea that's just sort of like taken as given in British political circles that the Tories just don't win young people, that young people just can't win, it's completely inconsistent with the European experience. I mean, something that's true in the US, by the way, is that even though young people do vote Democrat, I think it's something like 40% of millennials vote Republican.
Yeah.
And you don't see that split at all in the most recent YouGov polling. I mean, they're sort of outnumbered 3-1 amongst millennials.
And so the idea that the Tories can't win young people, whether that's like internationally true, it's true in the UK. At least at the moment, they don't seem able to win them.
Yeah, but I think
why is that they are, like, they should be able to? Clearly, the right wing can appeal to young people internationally, does appeal to young people internationally, especially young men, as we highlighted in the video I mentioned earlier. Why is it that the Tories specifically haven't been able to?
Well, I think some of the confusion here arises from the fact that we quite cheaply label like these new like anti-establishment populist parties as like far right or populist right, because as we've talked about in this podcast so many times, then in many ways they're not very right wing. Like a lot of them focus that they're very right wing on cultural issues, sure, but they're actually quite left wing on economic issues, or at least they sort of frame it as like the taking away from the globalists or whatever, and they're giving to the proper people. I mean, like, Le Pen is a good example of this. She shifted her campaign to focus on like cost of living issues, and quite effectively. And I think the issue here is that the Tories they were quite good at culture war stuff. I think it's fair to say under Boris Johnson maybe, but Sunak is not good at culture war stuff. And then on the economic stuff, Sunak is a classic old school, small c fiscal conservative. And that's just not interesting to young people who just are that, like, obviously who wants more austerity? Like it's just not going to win you any votes. But yeah, I think the other thing that's worth saying is that there is a little bit of evidence in the polling that actually young voters are moving, that there is some appetite for a slightly more like reform style party, because if you break down the UK polling in the basically like Gen Z and like early millennial, basically 18 to 30 or whatever it is, you do see a little bit of a gender divide, which is something we talked about in our previous video, over on TLDR Global, which describes the fact that actually in Gen Z, women are becoming significantly more liberal compared to men who are getting a bit more conservative, at least in their like how they self-identify. But you do see that actually young men are going slightly more reform than you'd think, and young women are going green. So green, I think, is the sort of like if you don't think Labour is sufficiently left wing. So you do see an element of radicalisation there, and you do see a little bit of appetite among some young people for a bit more sort of like, unorthodox right wing politics.
Yeah.
But it's something the Tories clearly haven't capitalised on.
I think you also can't discount the fact that the Tories are suffering from being in government for the last 14 years, whereas
that's true.
PVV in the Netherlands, Brothers of Italy in Italy, obviously, they were opposition parties coming into power. Whether they will continue to have that kind of young support after however many years they last in power, remains to be seen. And the other thing I was going to say is that I think they also suffer just from the voting system. In a lot of these European countries we're talking about, there's a more proportional allocation of votes to seats, whereas here, first past the post, if you dominate in the kind of younger demographic, that doesn't necessarily translate into lots more seats because young people aren't. Well, I mean, there are seats with more young people, but they're not concentrated in very specific constituencies. So I think they suffer from that as well. And yeah, I think when you break down that polling a little bit more as well, just to highlight how much of their own base that the Conservatives are losing, you can look at it based on how people voted in 2019 and how those parties, how much of that vote share they're maintaining.
Sure.
So Labour, apparently, according to this polling, are maintaining 83% of Labour voters from 2019. Conservatives are only maintaining 56% of Conservative voters from 2019. That's a big cut. And just to show how difficult their situation is, they're losing 15% to Labour and 21% to Reform. So this whole talk about do they need to shift far right to try and pick up those Reform voters, they're at risk of losing even more Labour supporters. Yeah. They're losing, I mean, slightly more to Reform than Labour, but broadly speaking, a pretty significant chunk on either side. So swinging wildly either way is going to damage them on whichever way they don't decide to go.
Reform could end up being a pretty big player in the next election then. Like, I mean, they're unlikely to win many seats because of the exact system you mentioned. But last time round in 2019, the Brexit Party, their equivalent, what percentage of the vote do they end up with? Like low, medium,
honestly,
middle, 7-ish, 6,
honestly,
7?
Don't know. That is a good question.
They ended up with like 6-7%. Let me Google while I'm talking.
But the real influence they had on that election was the ability to kind of push the Conservatives in a certain direction. I think that's the same role that Reform plays now. But I mean, last time round, the Brexit Party stood down in a number of Conservative seats, and Reform have said they're absolutely not going to do that, which just kind of makes things even harder for the Tories.
I do. That's a really interesting point you just mentioned about. Sorry, do you want to go for the?
I'm still Googling.
Yeah.
Keep going.
No, as I say, I do think it's a really interesting point you just mentioned about the voting system. I hadn't really thought about that. In that, if you're sort of like disenfranchised youth, you know, as I basically imagine most of those European young voters we were talking about are, then you don't really have an outlet in the UK. Like the Labour Party is your only real viable outlet, which might partly explain why they have like such a strong monopoly on it. But I imagine that given that I think if you're, again, disenfranchised youth, it's a bit of a like, you know, it's a bit of a cheap term, but you know what I mean. Your politics are probably actually be relatively radical. You know, I think you probably want some more serious economic reforms, and you're probably further right on cultural issues than the Labour Party is. Then you might be quite disappointed when Keir Starmer gets into office. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's an outlet because you get a change of government, and that's a sort of relief in a sense. But I think given that his revealed politics are pretty moderate, Starmer's revealed politics are pretty moderate, I think you might end up with quite a lot of disappointed people and quite a lot of frustrated voters.
Yeah, but I think on kind of both ends where there'll be lots of young people, again, I don't know what the polling is, but lots of young people disappointed by how moderate he is when they wish he'd be more left-wing socially.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know what the polling actually bears out on that.
That's interesting because you're right. I think there is a divide on cultural issues or social issues. Yeah. I think that is, especially, I think in the UK as well, the UK is actually a lot more left-wing on those issues than other countries are, especially amongst young people. Actually, there's quite good polling. The John Byrne Murdoch piece about the gender divide that we mentioned we did a video on TLDR Global about it. One of the things it shows is that in lots of countries, women are getting more liberal and men are getting more conservative. But in the UK, what actually happens is both get more liberal, but women get more liberal at a faster rate than men. So it's not that, you know, young men in the UK get more conservative. There's still a divide, but it's actually, there's a smaller divide than there is in other countries, and men are still getting more liberal. So I think on social issues, you're right. There's maybe like a little bit of space to disagree, but I think it's often overstated. But I do think the interesting thing is the strength of consensus amongst, I think basically the whole of the UK electorate on economic issues. On the, like, no one knows what it means, but people do want a more radical economic program, and at the moment there just isn't really a viable option for that.
Yeah, it's weird. These recent reports of Labour talking about trying to, I think the phrase was bomb-proof their manifesto, which basically just means like making it less radical, as if the less things you have and it makes it a safer manifesto. When polling, like you said, suggests that people are after something, even if we don't know exactly what those policies are. They want.
I think that's the issue. We don't know what the policies are. There's some really interesting polling done on millennials a couple of months ago, which was about how, like everyone else, basically young people, I think they didn't include Gen Z because it's just too young, and I don't know when the polling was done precisely. But millennials and other young people have quite right-wing attitudes on taxes. They want lots of spending, lots of other places, but they actually have far more right-wing attitudes on taxes than previous generations. but presumably just because they've lived with the highest tax burden.
Yeah.
So they just sort of think like we can't afford it.
And
I think it makes things difficult for Starmer though, because like the polling then tells you people want radical stuff but no more taxes.
Yeah, I think that kind of coincides though. People frustrated at living through a really high tax era, but while public services have not been performing well at all. You think if they're living through an era where they're paying lots of tax but public services are great, you'd assume that they would be pretty fine with a high tax era. But it does leave Labour in a kind of tricky position trying to weave through that slightly contradictory view.
Sort of thing.
Yeah.
Does this mean anything looking further forward, do you think? Is this a short-term shift? Or do we think this is a more systemic change when it comes to the difference between how younger people and older people are voting, and also how old you have to be to vote Conservative? Is this a kind of a Rishi Sunak right now issue, or is this a real issue for the Tories going to 2029, 2034? The easy questions. Look forward to 2039 and tell me how the Tories will do.
Give me like a minute or two to just think about it.
The answer, by the way, the Brexit Party got 2% of the vote.
Oh.
But they only ran in 275 constituencies. Yeah. So if you multiply that out, it's closer to 5-6. Yeah.
Okay, so big question. Is this a structural problem for the Tories? I think my answer is yes, it is a structural problem for the Tories. I think the reason it's a problem for the Tories is I think that conservatism, small c conservatism, just like sort of like playing it safe, muddling along, best personified maybe by the sort of David Cameron vibe, is just not appropriate for a time of crisis. And I basically, this is just like trivially true, like in a time of crisis, muddling along is just not good enough. It's just not politically palatable. And I think that we are probably entering a time of crisis, at least for like the next, who knows, a couple of years, let's say. I think that's motivated by a couple of things. I think one, the climate change. I mean, people sometimes push back against this point. Even if you don't think climate change is going to directly or adversely affect the UK, the energy transition will. The energy transition is just very, very difficult and probably very expensive. And you see that in parts of Europe. And it really brings to the fore quite difficult distributional questions that I don't think conservatives, small c conservatives, are equipped to answer. I think, by the way, Boris Johnson is a symptom of this. I think the success of Boris Johnson is a symptom of this. Boris Johnson was not a small c conservative in any sense of the word. He was a constitutional radical. His economic policies involved quite a big state. He was closer to a sort of Tony Blair in that respect than he was to David Cameron. And his cultural politics could be quite extreme as well. There was a sort of, some of the rhetoric was very like libertarian in parts. And he made his journalistic career off, slagging off Brussels and, like the freedom of the Great Britain or whatever. I'm not going to do a Boris Johnson impression. So I think that is my answer there. I think if you buy the sort of poly-crisis analysis, if you think that we are living in a time of crisis, then I do think it's a structural issue for the Conservatives, especially small c Conservatives. I think there are two caveats here. One, Tories have proven remarkably capable of rebranding. They haven't always been small c Conservative. Thatcher obviously wasn't small c Conservative, but I think there's no sort of radical right-wing economics available that's going to get us out of the poly-crisis. I don't think that's like feasible. There's basically nothing left to privatise. And the idea that the difficult distributional questions around the energy transition and the crisis generally are going to be solved by right-wing tax-like economics, I think is implausible. I just think that the energy crisis requires a bigger state, requires more active redistribution to make it politically palatable. But the Tories have proven remarkably capable of rebrand nonetheless. Boris Johnson, again, good example of that. The other thing is that I think that these are still problems for Labour. Like there are no easy answers to like, if you accept this poly-crisis or the sense of crisis that is going to permeate throughout the next couple of years. And so it could be one of those things where, sure, the Tories are going to struggle to sort of adapt ideologically, but again, Labour are going to struggle. And I think that's very, very apparent in the way Labour are positioning themselves at the moment. Like Labour clearly are trying to, even if their sort of actual political instincts are more left-wing, there's very little policy space between them, the Tories, I mean, the caveats aside, but like in terms of public spending, basically. And I think that is a symptom of the fact that there are these real fiscal constraints for states that rely on international capital markets. This is the thing, but to fund their public spending and their borrowing. And given those constraints, it's quite hard to respond adequately to the poly crisis, and the fact that taxing more progressively is difficult. It might be a good idea in theory, but basically taxing rich corporations and rich people has always been difficult, and will continue to be difficult for Labour. So I just think that basically, if you accept that there's a crisis, small c conservatism is insufficient, but the saving grace for the Tories is that A, they've proven very good at reforming themselves, and B, I don't think Labour have any easy answers to the crisis per se either.
Doesn't really sound like good news for anyone then.
No, politics is going to be tough. That's one of the reasons I think European politicians have not been entirely honest with their electorates about the fiscal constraints.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons I do like Macron is I think at the very least you have to admit that he is one of the most honest politicians when it comes to telling the public, look, we can't afford X or we can't afford Y unless you do this. And I think we haven't really had, it's been quite a long time since we've had the politics of real compromise and sacrifice. I think basically there's austerity, there's chipping away at the edges, and it was a sort of like slow demolition of like living standards, but really sort of hard and fast choices. It's been a while since we had that, and I don't think we're like necessarily politically ready for it. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty bleak.
Yeah.
Second section, we've ended on bleakness.
Yeah, who knows? There might be something great.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, who knows? No, I think the our last saving grace I'll mention is that I am personally optimistic that a lot of the sort of like geopolitical tensions and that sort of crisis, I think that will die down. No one else seems to think so. I just don't think. I think that the geopolitical competition between China and the US and all that sort of shenanigans will calm down. And I think that'll be fundamentally good for the global economy, and we might have a bit of relief there.
Great.
Yeah.
Just got to wait for America and China to calm down.
Yeah. Well,
easy.
And then hopefully the sort of protectionism will die down as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And that will
Nearly
help us.
there
Yeah. Okay.
Minutes away.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to the final part of the podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. As regular viewers will know, every week, each of our contributors brings one person who they think has done well, one world leader they think has won this week, and one world leader they think has lost this week. And we then move them on our World Leader Leaderboard up or down based on that ranking. Okay, let's start with you, Rory. Let's start with your winner of the week. Who's moving up on the board for you?
Well, having just spent the last 30 minutes telling everyone how badly he's doing, I'm going to move Rishi Sunak up.
Is that just so you've got space to move him down in the future?
Yeah. No, basically this is because of the restoration of the government in Northern Ireland. Okay. You can't completely attribute it to him and his government, but obviously there's been a lot of people working for the last 2 years trying to re-establish power sharing. And, the fact it has been re-established after a new deal between the government and the DUP is a good sign for him. Sunak's gone over to Northern Ireland for a little victory lap. Gives him a bit of breathing room after a pretty difficult year and a bit of however long he's been in office.
He's been at the bottom of the board for a while.
So, I think it's good for him. Basically.
It's a win for sure.
Yeah.
Politically, though, it's given me Windsor framework vibes in that I don't think he's got enough credit for it. In part because no one cares about Northern Ireland. It's just sad, isn't it? Well,
Yeah.
I think he should be getting more credit for that. It's quite an impressive achievement, actually. But he's not going to.
That's the most credit he's going to get.
Yeah.
Moving from absolutely abysmal to just bad on our leaderboard. Hope you're watching. Zach, who's your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is Donald Trump.
Oh, okay.
It's mainly because Biden is struggling. Biden cannot get out of the quagmire in the Middle East at the moment. And the fact that we've had a whole load of strikes on Iranian-backed militias and targets in Iraq and Syria mainly is just doesn't bode well for sort of like the risks of escalation. And I think Blinken has said today that there will be more strikes, which I don't think bodes well. And I think, this constant escalation in the Middle East is not good. Obviously not good in its own terms, but also not good domestically for Biden.
It's bad for Biden. Has Trump been saying anything about it that we're aware of?
I think he basically says if it was me, it wouldn't happen.
Love it.
He's got a point.
He's got a point. It wouldn't have happened. You can't prove it would have done. How are you going to prove it?
Another thing worth saying is that like basically every successful primary and presidential candidate has run on an anti-war platform in America for like the past 4 elections. And so the fact that Trump will get to run on a sort of like, look at Biden, he take us into forever wars again.
Yeah. There were no wars when I was in power.
Yeah, it's good for him. It's really good for him.
not fully true, but it's true
No,
enough.
no, yeah.
People say it.
Yeah.
People say it.
They do say it.
Rory, conversely, who is your loser of the week?
My loser of the week is Geert Wilders.
Oh.
I think he moved down for a similar reason maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, so I hope I'm not doubling up on this. But basically, Dutch government formation talks are still not going well for him. I think the last time he went down is because of this dispute over migration laws. But now there's been some more stuff, primarily the new social contract, which is one of the main parties within the formation negotiations. There's reports that they're having serious doubts about it because of Geert Wilders' party's view on things like freedom, fundamental freedoms and rule of law stuff. They're a bit more hesitant to launch, kind of jump into government with Geert Wilders. And also another party, which is the BBB. I'm not going to say their Dutch name, but it's the Farmer Citizen... Something like that. Farmer Citizen Movement. There's been these big farmer protests across Europe, and one of the protest leaders vaguely threatened or kind of implied a threat against an MP in that new social contract party. And the leader of the BBB, the Farmers' Party, effectively refused to condemn this veiled threat, which has put these two parties inside the negotiations at odds with each other on yet another thing. So, yeah, it's looking even more difficult than it already was. I think the politician who's kind of in charge of bringing these parties together and navigating the negotiation is going to issue a report next week or this week, I can't remember.
Okay.
Kind of like a status update, so we'll see what that says.
Okay.
But, yeah, I'm moving Geert Wilders down.
Seems fair.
Do you know where the VVD are at the moment?
Not really.
That was a bit of a falling out, but I don't think they've said anything since.
Yeah, I think I haven't seen much about them in relation to it, but maybe I'm just not looking hard enough, to be fair.
Zac, who is your loser of the week?
It's a bit lazy for me because we did a video over this on TLDR Global, but my loser is Turkish President Erdogan. And it's partly because of the ongoing economic crisis, but also because he just lost his central bank governor. She cited personal reasons, and that is almost definitely true. There's been this sort of ongoing scandal about whether or not I think she appointed her father to a job in the central bank, and Turkish media has been all over her for it. But the fact that he has lost another central bank governor in God knows how long, I think it's the 5th in 5 years or something like that, just really doesn't bode well, and it won't inspire international confidence in the Turkish economy, which is it's very much needed if it wants to escape autarky. But yeah, so that's my one.
Okay.
Yeah.
The board has really changed today and in the last few days. There's a real...
Sorry.
The top of the board had a lot of people, but it's really shifted. We got a lot of people who have shifted down from actively good spots to kind of middle good. If anything, like the top of the board looks very empty, and there's a lot of bad people too. Like bad and very bad.
It's funny just seeing Rory like staring blankly into space.
Yeah, like I'm
on the camera.
I'm looking straight at Mohammed bin Salman right now, I think.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that's how the leaderboard shakes out today. As always, we're curious. Who would you move? Who would you add to the board? Where would you put them? We are committing there'll be 2 new entrants into the board on Thursday, sorry. We record on Wednesday, released on Thursday. Thursday's episode, there'll be 2 brand new people. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
New entrants on the board, exclusively on the TLDR podcast.
So exciting.
Who could they be? Place your bets now.